Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll start with the chance for you to sort of each introduce yourselves. The first question I suppose to ask is, were you expecting Russia to behave in this way?
Thank you very much, Molly. Thank you for the invitation to be here at the Oxford Union this afternoon. This is a terrible time for Ukraine, but also for Europe, and for that matter, for the world, this unprovoked, premeditated aggression. I feel it very deeply because I spent 4 years living and working in Ukraine at the beginning of the 2000s, and I still have many friends who are there. I want to just touch very briefly on 4 points. One is what's in Putin's mind, then the Ukrainian resistance, Western resolve, and where does it go next? We've spent a lot of time speculating what is in Putin's mind. I think what's become increasingly clear is that he is obsessed about Ukraine. He has been locked away for much of the last 2 years out of fear of catching COVID, and I think that has not helped his frame of mind. I found the televised meeting of his National Security Council just over a week ago rather telling, that even very senior people like the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service were nervously rehearsing their lines in front of him, and it was clear there'd been no process of collective decision-making. Putin has this sort of mystical, pseudo-historical view of Russia, the Russian world, incorporating Ukraine and Belarus, which doesn't stand up to historical scrutiny and is certainly not shared by historians in Ukraine. But this obsession goes back certainly as far as the Orange Revolution in 2004. It was during the time I was in Ukraine, when Putin had clearly been complicit in trying to get Viktor Yanukovych into the presidency in a rigged election, even went as far as going on Ukrainian television after the second round, before the official result was announced, and saying that Yanukovych had been elected, when most Ukrainian voters could see that wasn't the case. So Putin was humiliated at that time, and I think has been deeply unhappy about Ukraine ever since. He's made 2 very serious miscalculations. First of all, about how the Ukrainians would react to his invasion with massed force. And what the Ukrainians have shown is that they will defend their country. They're fighting very bravely. They're being led very bravely by Volodymyr Zelensky. Huge numbers of Ukrainians have volunteered, have got weapons training, and their armed forces are at this moment fighting extremely bravely. And of course, this shouldn't really come as any surprise to us. At the end of the Second World War, when Stalin had just retaken Western Ukraine, the Red Army was at the height of its power. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian partisans held them off for the best part of 10 years. And we've seen that more recently, since the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and then the fomenting of conflict in the Donbass. The Ukrainians have fought back in the Donbass. There have been more than 14,000 deaths and millions forced to flee in the last 8 years. That was before the present invasion. I think the other big miscalculation has been how Western Europe, the wider free world, would react to this. And it has been with remarkable resolution and unity. And just to pick one example, I think the decision by the new German Chancellor on behalf of the new German government really to reverse a lot of the basis of German foreign and defense policy over the last decades is very, very striking. That Germany is now putting a lot more money into defense, is going to meet in practice that goal of 2% of GDP spent on defense, and is providing defensive weaponry to a country which is defending itself as war. All this is the Western countries have put in place a massive range of sanctions against investment, trade, aviation, shipping, even sporting and culture. I won't enumerate it all now, you've seen it, leaving Russia isolated and a pariah. But this is really, as I started, about Putin, not about the Russian people. It's about Putin and his cronies. So where do we go next? I think it could go one of two ways. Either Putin will continue to use massive force, out of proportion, indiscriminate, and cause a great deal of death and destruction. Or a way will be found to stop him, to bring this to some peaceful resolution. There's already been one round of talks on the border with Belarus between Ukrainian and Russian delegations, and they agreed there would be a further meeting. I don't know whether there was any meeting of minds at all at that. And then I was encouraged to see in the Financial Times this morning a headline that China has started to talk about a role as a mediator. And possibly China, which has decent relations both with Russia and Ukraine, has been trying to sit on the fence. It abstained in the United Nations Security Council, might be able to negotiate a way through. We can only hope so. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor MacFarlane?
Thank you. It's an honor to be on this panel, and thank you for the invitation. I'm told I have 5 minutes. I will keep to 5 minutes. I want to talk briefly about the implications of Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine for regional and broader international order. After all, that's what I do. I'm a professor of international relations. A few brief comments. One, this appears to be the final nail in the coffin of the post-Cold War era of peace and integration. That probably includes significantly greater difficulty in sustaining the arms control regime, whatever's left of it. Two, at a regional level, I suppose most people here don't remember the Charter of Paris for a New Europe in 1990. This was a vision of one Europe whole and free. Now, that was always problematic, but I think it's probably over and done with. We are now apparently moving towards a clear and deep line of division crystallizing in Europe once again. For those of us who remember the Cold War, this is all very familiar. Thirdly, as was mentioned, a united policy has emerged in both NATO and the EU with respect to Russia. The common security and defense policy and the common foreign and security policy of the EU have existed for many years, but there's no meat in it. Now there is meat in it, and they are capable of acting together. Fourth, Russia, increasingly isolated, will likely turn towards China, increasing its dependence on the Chinese, and that has broad implications for the global balance of power. Fifthly, the post-Cold War peace dividend, i.e. the diversion of defense spending to domestic purposes, has ended, seemingly. Germany's change of mind on this subject was just mentioned. I won't go into detail. In terms of American foreign policy, in a way, Ukraine, I'm sorry to say, is rather inconvenient. The US, for example, has long contemplated an eastward transition in its global focus, a turn to Asia and the Pacific. The previous president even suggested that the US might withdraw from NATO to get on with more important things. That's not going to happen. And as for NATO itself, NATO has been an institution in search of a mission since the end of the Cold War. Now it's got one. I return to where I started. The post-Cold War era is now well and truly over. What appears to be replacing the long peace is a renewed and rather traditional great power competition in Europe and possibly globally. I have one caveat, and that is that this prognosis is based on the assumption that Putin remains in power. His position, to my mind, remains strong, but if the Ukraine war continues for a long time and goes badly, and sanctions really begin to bite, it's plausible he could be replaced. The open question then would be, by whom and what difference would it make to Russian foreign policy? Allow me to close with the observation that while what I've said is pretty anodyne and analytical, at a personal level, I find Russia's aggression in Ukraine to be deeply upsetting. We all owe it to the victims to express solidarity and to act on it. Thank you.
And so David.
Well, thank you, Molly. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks to all of you for coming and obviously showing your interest and concern in this. Your question, Molly, at the beginning, did we expect it? I didn't expect it, but I didn't expect Crimea in 2014. And I thought if he did do it, he would probably stop in the Luhansk and Donetsk area and reinforce there and try to make rump Ukraine unviable. I was wrong, and I now suspect he will go the whole way, but I hope Robert is right and that actually there is still a chance for peace. I think in assaulting Ukraine, he's assaulted the post-war and post-Cold War international order in exactly the way that Professor MacFarlane has been saying. It's over. Something very dramatic has happened in the last few days, and we have a Russia now that is completely contemptuous of the rules and regulations it itself helped to set and signed up to, both when it was the Soviet Union and as Russia, which was that borders in Europe can't be changed by force and that we all respect one another's sovereignty. And Putin hasn't even manufactured a crisis and tried to take it to the UN. He's also rejected the UN Charter, which as a permanent member of the Security Council, of course, Russia should be upholding. So this is a massive change in the outlook for the international order, I think. And I very much agree with my colleagues that this partly comes in Putin's case, I think, from it's not just this vengeful, isolated, extraordinary view he has of Ukraine and how it should exist as part of Russia, but I think it's also deeply, it's a result of deeply misunderstanding the world around him for whatever reasons, and I share Robert's view about some of the factors at work. I'm sure, and Robert knows much more than I do, that this has been a great bolster for Ukrainian nationalism. I mean, it's only, I think, 20 years ago that a majority of Ukrainians didn't want to join NATO and were actually sort of vaguely pro-Russian. Well, you can reverse that now. And that doesn't save them in the short run, but I think it makes it very difficult to imagine Ukraine being reintegrated into Russia in the long run, even if Putin occupies it for the foreseeable future. And that surely wasn't the purpose of what he thinks he's doing. I'm also struck by the bravery of Russians. I mean, let's forget here that there are an awful lot of Russians, I suspect, who don't like what's going on. You have to be very brave to come out in opposition to this. And it's not just in Petersburg and Moscow where this has happened. The numbers may not be great, but when you risk being beaten to a pulp, it's extremely brave to come out at all. And there was an amazing petition or statement yesterday by many of Russia's leading scientists objecting to what has happened. So I think it's very important we remember that our quarrel is with Putin and his clique and not with the Russian people as a whole. And certainly if the stories and accounts of young conscripts arriving and not knowing why they're there and wanting to give up their weapons or anything to go by. I mean, Putin has a domestic issue here. Of course, he can squash protests, but I think it's important for the medium and long term to remember that that's what a lot of Russians basically feel. They're not happy at seeing this world order overturned like this. I very much agree with Professor MacFarlane that two of the most important things that have happened, and again, this is Putin underestimating, are the reactions of the EU and NATO. I think Putin thought that the EU would be divided and pretty feeble, would probably not put a sanctions package together that really had any bite, certainly didn't after the Russians invaded Crimea in 2014. Instead, it's produced probably the most ferocious sanctions package we've ever seen, striking not just at national banks, but at the Russian central bank, which at a stroke means that half Russia's reserves are out of action. They're unavailable for Russia. And we've seen the response this has had in terms of having to have emergency interest rate hikes, run on the banks, the collapse of the ruble, the closure of markets. None of that is going to stop Putin in the short run, but it's certainly going to have an impact on people around Russia. And it does make the calculations for sustaining the Russian invasion and the Russian state in the medium term much more complicated. And NATO too. I think, it's only 2 years ago that President Macron said that he thought that NATO was probably brain dead. Well, it certainly isn't brain dead now. And the degree to which countries have been willing to reinforce the eastern flank of NATO, i.e. Russia's western flank, has been very striking, including British efforts in the Baltic states. And very importantly, I think, President Biden, although, as Professor MacFarlane has said, wants to concentrate on the Far East, and Putin may have wondered whether there's the bandwidth in Washington to concentrate on two crises at once, has moved troops to Europe. So NATO is in business and working. And it's being reinforced now by the fact, again, as Professor MacFarlane said, that the EU has suddenly decided that it is going to find money and have its own arms supply policy to Ukraine. I mean, this is a first. So taken together, these two reactions and the two great sort of Western organizations are very striking, and they're bad news for Putin. And I think he underestimated that. Again, I would just endorse what has been said about Germany. Here is a huge sea change. The Germans in the past have, certainly since the Second World War, wanted a relationship with Russia that is essentially a commercial and a cultural one. Now they are in the business of spending an extra 100 billion euros on their defense, suddenly coming up to the target of 2% of GDP for NATO members, which they've constantly resisted. Putin has achieved something that 4 previous American presidents asked the Germans to do, and they declined. So that, again, is surely the law of unintended consequences as far as Putin is concerned. And the fact that the Germans are going to take this completely different posture and have anyway put into abeyance, and I suspect instead put into abeyance Nord Stream 2, this pipeline project, have agreed to supply weapons. This is going to change the balance of power inside Europe and inside NATO. It's hard to know in the medium term what this means, but suddenly the Germans are going to be much more powerful military players. And it cannot have been in Putin's calculations that he wanted a powerful German military on his western border. And incidentally, I think it raises issues about what happens in the EU now, because if President Macron is re-elected, and if you have a German chancellor in Scholz who is interested in projecting European power, this could change the way that the European Union develops. I also think that there is, as Professor MacFarlane has said, this issue about China. What does it mean for Russia, for China, for the West? China, I think, will see both threats and opportunities. I'm struck by the degree to which the Chinese, anyway, so far have sort of backed away from endorsing this. And as Robert said, have been looking in the last 24 hours to play the role of peacemakers. Of course, they will be very concerned to see how the West responds. They will gauge what the United States does for their own interests in Taiwan. But my personal view is it's a mistake to think that this marriage of convenience at the moment between Russia and China goes very deep. I think that while both would like to overthrow the liberal world order and have an order that is based, I think, in Gideon Rachman's phrase, based on a world order of power relationships, I think they are probably very reluctant to endorse the change of borders by force. And that we will have to see how this plays out. It's worth remembering that the Russians, if they allow themselves to be forced towards China because of the Western reaction, and they may have no option, will be the junior partner. When the Soviet Union collapsed, when I was in Moscow, Russia had a bigger economy than China. Now it's the 10th of the size of China's economy. When I was there, it spent 1.5 times as much on defense as China. Now it's vastly reduced. And the Russians will feel very uncomfortable about that relationship. They're fearful of the Chinese underneath, and I think the Chinese themselves don't forget that the Russians may seem a long time ago, but Chinese have long memories, changed the borders in the Far East in the 19th century, and China then lost, as a result of Russian imperialism, 1.5 million hectares of land, which they still refer to as the unrecovered territories. So there are some fundamental differences of interest here. Finally, let me just touch on nuclear issues, because we've had Putin anyway implicitly threatening that he might use nuclear weapons. This, again, is a complete departure from the way in which the international order has been involved in the last 60 years. It's not since Cuba that we have been worrying about whether in Europe we might be faced with some kind of nuclear exchange. My own view is that Putin won't use nuclear weapons, but I was wrong about him invading, so I might be wrong about this. And certainly you can't, I think, take any risks. But what I am sure is that it will push again against the Non-Proliferation Treaty, make it harder to contain the spread of nuclear weapons. It's already striking that the former Japanese Prime Minister has talked about asking the Americans to deploy nuclear weapons to Japan. And I wonder about other countries, Turkey, thinking about whether they perhaps need nuclear weapons. And again, it cannot have been Putin's intention to make it more risky for Russia, with more countries developing nuclear weapons around his borders. Just to conclude, somebody reminded me earlier this week of a quip by Lenin, who is, I confess, not my favorite. But he said that decades go by and nothing happens, and then weeks go by and decades happen. And I think that's exactly what we've been living through.
Thank you. And when we come to the role of the UK, do you think that the UK could have done more to prevent the escalation of the crisis in Russia and Ukraine? You've all spoken about the West's response, but should we have been responding to this months or years ago?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
Hindsight is a wonderful thing, isn't it? You know, we have a disaster like this and look back and ask ourselves, what could we have done? Should we have done more? Well, probably we should. But if you just take the UK, which you've asked about, the UK, really ever since 2014, has been supporting Ukraine with economic assistance, with military assistance, with training and weapons, and that's been considerably stepped up in the last few months. So I think the UK has actually been leading our allies in that support of Ukraine, and many other allies have now come in to support that as well. I think there's a rather dangerous fallacy, which is that when there's a disaster in the world, like the invasion of Ukraine, it must be the West's fault. I'm sorry, I don't subscribe to that.
I agree with that, if I may. I guess concerning the UK, I think the UK, like my country, Canada, has been doing about all it can. The question is whether what we have meets the dimensions of the problem. And this is why the United States is so important, and Germany is also very important. None of the older former great powers or current great powers is in a position to do this alone. It has to be done together. And I think that we are making good progress on this. Quite how Putin responds to this, if he gets into deep water, brings me back to your point on his mention of the possible use of nuclear weapons. Frankly, I share your doubt that this will happen, but I also I understand that I really have no idea what goes on in this man's head. It's just a mystery. And this is vaguely disturbing.
And to that point, I think, we have one-man rule in Russia. Even during the communist period, you had a Politburo. What is so difficult, and I think Robert tried very well to describe Putin, is getting alongside the way he works and thinks. This is very, very hard to know. I mean, I would just add one point in answer to your question about the UK. I absolutely agree with Robert. Hindsight is wonderful, and it's very easy. Where there hasn't been hindsight, and where I do think the British performance is open to criticism, is what's known as the London laundromat, and the degree to which we have been processing huge sums of Russian money, which we've known to be, in quotes, dirty money, but haven't done anything about it. Now, I think that is a signal, whatever you think about the morality of having the money here and the people who come with it. The issue, I think, if you're looking at it from Moscow, the assumption you make is, well, they talk tough, but they don't mean it. And that was also true about the sanctions package we were going to put together after Crimea, and we didn't really, though Robert's much more expert on this than I am. And I think the same thing, you can level the same kind of charge about weak signalling at Germany, because it is extraordinary that it is only now, anyway to my mind, that Nord Stream 2 has been cancelled, or at least put into abeyance. And I think this creates a sort of a set of assumptions in Moscow about what it's safe to do. So I wouldn't criticize the way we have been trying to respond as this crisis has built up, but I think I do feel that we should have been sending stronger signals, particularly since 2014.
And so, David, do you think that changes the way that we ought to be responding to the crisis now?
No, I think we are responding now, absolutely in the way we should. And if I'm honest, I'm delighted and a bit surprised at the degree of solidarity and the impact of sanctions that we now see. I would have been more cynical and more doubtful that this would actually happen. And I'm certainly surprised and delighted personally by the German response. And I don't, it would be very nice if we could create a no-fly zone, but I'm not absolutely sure the Prime Minister's right. You create a no-fly zone, you're in World War III. And that's actually not going to help Ukraine any more than it's going to help the rest of us. So I wouldn't criticize what we're doing at the moment. I think ratcheting up the sanctions even more is a good thing to do. And I think the most important two things I would be very keen to do are to keep signaling to the Ukrainians, as meetings like this do, that we're absolutely with them. And if the EU can at least say that it wants to open negotiations for EU membership, I think that would be a very strong signal. Of course, it's not about to happen, but it's a signal. And the other thing I think the West needs to do is try and occupy more of the communication space inside Russia. Russians are cut off by their own state media from a lot of the broadcasting, but it's not impossible to get in, certainly through social media and so on, and making them aware, first of all, what the truth is on the ground, and you're arrested if you call it an invasion. But they need to be perfectly well aware of what is going on. But secondly, also to pass this message, which I was talking about in my introductory remarks, but our quarrel is not with them, but it is with Putin.
Can I follow up on that? I think within Russia, let's not forget that a very large number of Russians have either family or friends in Ukraine. So whatever the state does to clamp down on news, they'll find it much more difficult to clamp down on all those phone calls, texts, WhatsApp messages, whatever it is, of people in Ukraine telling them what's actually going on. So I think that will be undermining the message that the state media are trying to hold. And so far we've had a remarkably wide level of agreement among the panelists, which is good. But if I can just introduce a note of criticism of the way that the British government has reacted. In general, I think they've done very well. But one thing I'm less happy about has been the Home Office's very small-minded attitude to loosening the visa regime, allowing in Ukrainians fleeing for their lives from Ukraine. The rest of the European Union, the Schengen area, hasn't had visas for Ukraine for several years now. I think it's really time that we followed suit.
Could I just add something on that? I share your dismay about the UK government's approach to refugee status or humanitarian protection status in the UK. I thought when I heard this, it was completely mad, because there was absolutely no way that policy could be sustained in the face of the pressure that the UK faced from its own population, but also from friends and allies. And I'm glad to say that there seems to be some movement on this already.
Molly, can I just add that there's a pattern here, and of course, both Robert and Professor MacFarlane are right. 2 weeks ago, we were very slow to introduce sanctions after the Russians moved across the border and sanctioned, I think, 5 banks and 3 oligarchs, and the 3 oligarchs were already sanctioned by the United States. So this looked pretty much like gesture politics. And then there was huge pressure, not least inside the Conservative Party, and we suddenly shifted. And exactly as you've described, the pressure has built up over doing something about refugees, and 2 days later, we have to ramp it up. It's such a pity that we don't do it when it happens, and we have to play catch-up.
We have seen almost an unprecedented level of economic sanctions. I wonder if you could speak a little more to how effective you think that will be in the short term and the long term. Professor MacFarlane, if you could start.
Sure. Well, I think I've watched sanctioning of Russia for a long time, including in 2014, and I agree with what I gather is the sense of the panel that the 2014 sanctions, which still endure in the EU context, were a surprising show of unity for the EU, by the way, but they were pretty marginal in terms of actual effects on the Russian economy. The current sanctions will have a much more, and are having a much more significant effect. That's not least the sanctions on banks. But I think that the one apple that nobody wants to bite quite yet is prohibition on the import of Russian oil and gas. And I understand why that is so, but if you look at the share that oil and gas play in Russian foreign exchange income, this is the big one. And we aren't yet sure we want to do that, not least because of the trends in energy prices in the UK and in Europe and in the States already. In that context, if I may just, a footnote, the rapid increase in oil prices is partly a result of uncertainty caused by the Ukraine crisis, but it's also a result of the constriction of production by states like Saudi Arabia to sustain the price. And I think if Saudi Arabia loosened the tap a bit, we might have a slightly different view.
Yeah, on the oil and gas, of course, Western Europe has got into a position where it is to a high degree dependent on Russian supplies of oil and gas, which can't quickly and easily be replaced by other sources. The goal has been clear for years that dependence should be reduced. And I think now really is the time to do it. And as our Prime Minister has put it, to stop mainstreaming this addiction of Russian hydrocarbons. And that's feeding the main flow of money into the Russian economy. But if we just stopped it, a lot of people in Europe would be freezing because there's no immediate replacement.
I'm very keen to leave plenty of time for audience questions, but I'll finish with one final question from me. As we watch the war progress, is there anything that you feel the general public should pay attention to, which we're currently perhaps not?
I've got one, which is quite speculative. One thing that has concerned me about the current progress, other than just the mass tragedy that it creates, is that Putin is having trouble at the moment militarily. He is having trouble in part because of Western military assistance to Ukraine. And consequently, it must occur to him, the temptation must occur to him to do something about that by interdicting that or by retaliating against a NATO country, in which case the flag goes up.
Can I think, just endorse that? I think that our leaders need to be very clear with us that dealing with this is painful. It's not just going to be painful for the Russians and terrifying for the Ukrainians, but we've got to be willing to take economic pain ourselves. And just to remind people, actually, that liberal societies, democracies need defending. This is not a natural state of affairs. And perhaps, certainly my generation, us oldies, have been very lucky since the Second World War in assuming that this is the natural state of things. And we've suddenly been tipped back into something that looks horribly like the 1930s. And it's a big shock for us. You know, nobody since Hitler has annexed other bits of Europe. And now this has happened. And I think being honest with the public about what this means and the sacrifices we may be called upon to make is very important in sustaining the resistance to Putin's vision of the world. He may be gone tomorrow. My guess is he won't. And I think this is a medium term at the very best problem. And we've got to have the strategic patience and the resilience and the determination to stick with it.
In which case, I look for questions from the audience. If you just raise your hand, I'll begin with the member just here.
Thank you very much. Could it be said that, obviously you mentioned hindsight before, and I do a history degree, I'm afraid. So would you say that there is a role to be played by the failure of the West to properly integrate the post-Soviet Russia into a new kind of, a Western alliance? And there was suggestion of Putin wanting to join NATO early on in his rule. Wasn't that a missed opportunity, which we regret? Thank you.
I would say that we tried very hard, particularly in the 1990s, to create opportunities for Russia to take part in European security structures. In 1997, we agreed with Russia the NATO-Russia Charter of Rome, the NATO-Russia Council. There were discussions about Russia joining NATO, but Russia wanted to join in such a way that it had a veto, as on the UN Security Council, and that wasn't going to be acceptable to the rest of NATO. But the expansion of NATO was all driven by the security wishes of those countries which had lived close to Russia and wanted to feel more secure inside the NATO security structure. It wasn't aimed at Russia, it was listening to the security interests of the Central and Eastern Europeans. I think that too can often be a problem in this debate. You get it, I think, particularly across the Atlantic, where people focus on what are US interests, what are Russian interests, and forget about the interests of all those European countries in between, like 43 million Ukrainians.
I think I agree completely that the purpose of NATO expansion or enlargement had nothing particularly to do with Russia per se. It had to do with the demand coming from the region, and also, as NATO made clear in its enlargement paper, this is about spreading stability, democracy, and peace. Now, the problem, unfortunately, is that very few people in Russia actually believed that was what we were doing. I mean, many people in Russia asked, why did NATO continue to exist after the Cold War, since it was established as a Cold War alliance directed against Russia or the Soviet Union, and then the Warsaw Pact. But that's water under the bridge. NATO stayed. NATO has played a constructive role in European security, in Yugoslavia, for example, in the 1990s. But one of the unintended consequences of this, I think, is a gradual creeping alienation of Russia.
I think this is a very good and important question, and one that will go on being debated for a long time to come. There are new books out about it, the promises that may or may not have been made by James Baker when the Soviet Union collapsed, promises that may or may not have been made later in the decade to the then Russian leadership. And I was with the British Prime Minister in Moscow just after 9/11 when Putin actually raised this question with him about could we join NATO? And I think what we need to do is put this into context. As Robert has said, you have to remember all the countries that had escaped from the clutches of the Soviet Union and had joined NATO in order not to be in the clutches of Russia. And the idea we're then going to invite Russia in was a very, very big leap. And I think it wasn't conceivable that Russia could join. I think there is a legitimate discussion to be had about whether you could have tried to devise some sort of different European security architecture where Russia had some sort of partnership role without the veto. And that is indeed what Blair and Bush started to discuss with Putin after 9/11. And as Robert has mentioned, the NATO-Russia Council was developed. Before that, the discussions with Russia in NATO had been 19-1. The idea was that we would develop a council in NATO where everybody was equal, and we would have a joint agenda. And it would be on things like cyber and weapons of mass destruction, all these sorts of things. And Putin promised that he would be sending a very senior and serious ambassador to NATO to try and put flesh onto this idea. This chap never turned up. And I can remember American colleagues saying to me, well, this will be very hard for Putin to sell in Moscow because the general staff need NATO, otherwise they've even got an enemy. And I mean, actually there's a mirror image here. I mean, we can imagine our own military wondering what they were for. But I think even if you go for the counterfactual, and I think it's a perfectly legitimate debate, the problem about having a partner in Russia after, say, 2001 was it could only work if we had shared values. And it became perfectly clear between, say, let's go to 2005, that Putin was not a democrat. You know, Putin is basically a KGB officer, and he does not share the liberal values of the West. And he would have had to have been the champion of a new and democratic Russia that would be a partner with the NATO countries, all of whom have to be democracies to be part of NATO. And I think it's very hard to imagine Russia developing like that under Putin. You can argue, well, if we'd had the partnership, maybe they would have been democratic. I find that very hard to believe. That was never Putin's agenda. So I don't think it would have worked. But for all that, there's a little bit of me that wishes that we had tried harder in the 90s, pre-Putin, on the economic side to help Russia when oil was only $10 a barrel and people were selling practically their children in the street, I'm afraid. And you do wonder what would have happened if a different sort of regime had emerged in the late 90s.
We have time, just a few more brief questions. I recognise the Honourable Librarian-elect.
Thank you very much. And it's something that you've all touched on briefly, but I was wondering whether you see this as being a knee-jerk reaction to demands to NATO that didn't get accepted, or as part of a long-term strategy that Putin has with regards to the former Soviet states that might have potential connotations for the Baltic states or Georgia in the future, especially given his actions in Kazakhstan a few months ago?
I mean, I don't know. I wish I did. I mean, I think one of the things we don't know, and as my colleagues have been saying too, we don't know Putin's mind. Do we think he would go on if he does achieve what he thinks he wants to in Ukraine? Does he stop there? He's certainly, in some of the statements he's made, he implies that he wants to reorder more than just the relationship with Ukraine. He's already, while we've all been focused on Ukraine, he's reabsorbed, to all intents and purposes, Belarus. So I don't think you can rule it out, which is why it's very important to be sending strong signals that we mean what we say. The difficulty, of course, with Georgia and Moldova, as opposed to the Baltic states, is that they do not have the Article 5 guarantee. President Biden has been absolutely clear that 1 inch of NATO territory and it's war, but you cannot say that for Georgia and Moldova.
No, if I may, I agree with Sir David. I really don't think that there is a grand secret plan out there. But I do think that Putin has certain well-established preferences as to the structure of regional order in the former Soviet space. That doesn't mean invading everybody and taking them over. I think he's reasonably happy with Kazakhstan. He's reasonably happy with Uzbekistan. He's reasonably happy with Armenia, not least because he now has his fingers around Armenia's neck, effectively, in conjunction with the ongoing conflict in Azerbaijan. I do worry about Georgia, because if you look at where Russia has actually used force against neighboring states, it tends to be states that express their avid desire for membership in NATO. Ukraine is one, the other one is Georgia.
I think what we're dealing with here is not some grand plan, but it's more a set of attitudes among certainly the Russian leadership, but I think quite widespread in Russia, that Russia is a great power and is surrounded by lesser powers, or if you like, second-class powers, which do not have the same rights as Russia. And this comes out in expressions like Russia's near abroad. So in other words, they see the countries close to them as in some ways different from those who are further away. Or they talk about a sphere of Russia's privileged interest. But this doesn't square at all with the international rule of law, the legal reality that these states since 1991 have been sovereign members of the United Nations with all the same rights to independence and territorial integrity. But I think that's the problem we're up against, that for the Russian leadership, with a lot of sympathy in Russia, they just don't see these as fully valid sovereign states.
If I could just footnote that, I think that's exactly right. But one of my pitfalls as an academic is spending time reading things like Commonwealth of Independent States internal documents, an odd preoccupation. But anyway, the interesting thing to follow up on the point about whether Russia considers its neighbors fully sovereign and independent, I would only note that in 1991 and again in 1993, first in the Declaration of the Commonwealth of Independent States and second in the Charter of the Commonwealth of Independent States, those principles, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference in internal affairs, were explicitly accepted by Russia. And Russia has, to my mind, systematically violated those principles ever since. So they're a tough customer to work with.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but as you all know, and as I hope our audience knows, we'll be hosting an open discussion here in the chamber in just a few minutes on the crisis. Perhaps you could leave us each with, very briefly, a few, I suppose, food for thought for the discussion that's about to commence.
Okay. One thought that has struck me is that the roots of this crisis really go back a very long way. And let's just pick one episode, the Second World War. The Second World War pitted the two great totalitarian powers, Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, against each other. And as we all know, Nazi Germany lost. The Soviet Union came out on the winning side. Nazi Germany was occupied, it was denazified. A lot of people were put on trial, some of them were executed. And the Germans as a whole learnt their lesson and have become thoroughly pacifist. And what we've seen in the last few days has actually been the first time since the Second World War that Germany has started to come out of that very pacifist attitude. For the Soviet Union, there was never a reckoning. There was no accountability for all those crimes, the horrors, the deaths of Soviet communism. Nobody was ever brought to account.
Right, my point is much simpler. Thinking about the subsequent discussion, I think one thing we all need to think about is, given the constraints of deterrence and also the regional balance of forces in the western part of the former Soviet Union, what can we actually do more effectively to support Ukraine?
And I think my point would be one I touched on, really, which is the fragility of democracy and our values and the need to defend them. And the irony that actually nobody queues up to, as far as I know, to go and be a refugee living in Russia or China. But our values remain extraordinarily powerful, and they have just reasserted themselves. And I think especially for the young generation you represent, it's terribly important that you take on the role of championing them and defending them, particularly at a time when our democracies are in some disarray, I think. Polarization is bad. There are difficulties both on this side of the Atlantic and on the others. But I think don't lose sight of how valuable open societies are and how vulnerable they are and how much it matters that you care about them.
Thank you. Our guests joined us today on very short notice, and we're very grateful to them. Please join me in thanking them for their time.